My name is Jamin Brophy Warren, and as mentioned, I used to be a fellow here. So I'm going to walk through a couple different things. I'm going to explain a little bit about myself and my background. I'm going to try and give a very, very brief primer of video games and why I think they're very important, and then I'll talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing, I guess just in the past year or so. So my personal history. I believe there's one slide. There we go. Okay. So I left when I was here at the Academy. I was doing a lot of freelance writing, and I was really interested in music, and I was always writing about music, and I started to branch out into some other types of things, and it worked out that my first job after the Academy was at the Wall Street Journal. It just so happened that all of the music writing that I had been doing, the Journal was looking for someone to do more cultural coverage, and they were very interested in music and asked me all kinds of questions. And so while I was at the Journal, I wrote about just about everything. I was an arts and entertainment reporter. I didn't have a specific beat. So I wrote about kids who jump rope in North Carolina. I wrote about gold records. So the people who make gold records, the music industry is having a lot of problems, and you think of a classic 80s record producer having a wall of gold records. Well, there's this cottage industry of people who make those gold records, and so as the music industry declined, these poor fellows saw their business basically evaporate and were living with their parents. And one guy was working for like a Frames and Things now, because he was working in the framing business, and in the 80s he partied with Van Halen and with drugs and women, and now he was helping little old ladies with framing their Van Gogh, like the little Van Gogh prints they would get at Target. So I really what I loved about working as a journalist is that I got to hear all different types of stories and tell other people's stories for them. One of the problems, though, is I didn't really have a focus. There wasn't anything in particular that I felt like was mine that I could own, and most other reporters had some specific area that they would consider their beat or their domain for a period of time. So I felt really adrift, and so I started to look around and started to think about what were the things that I had done consistently throughout my entire life? What were the things that I really loved and I really enjoyed? And so the thing I came up with was video games. Video games, I would like to think of myself as a well-rounded cultural individual, but video games are one of the few things that I've done pretty much my entire existence. And that's not unusual. I'm 28, and so most people in my age, plus or minus 10 years, at some point in life, video games have played some role in their everyday existences. So I thought, well, this would be great. I'm still at the Wall Street Journal, and video games are this area that the Journal isn't really writing about very often, because they had hired me to be their young person reporter. So they'd say, what is this Facebook thing? And I would go off and write a story, and they'd say, what is this, what else? What is this, MP3 thing? What is this music sharing thing? And I'd go off, this YouTube thing. Oh my goodness, I wrote so many stories about YouTube. Second Life, I did a bunch of stories on Second Life also. And so that was kind of my role. So I thought, well, of course, I should just write about video games. So I sat down and I wrote this very, very long brief, and it was maybe 3 or 4 pages long. And there were a bunch of things I saw, kind of like signs outside of my office that were happening. So this was an ad that ran maybe 2 or 3 years ago for a game called Grand Theft Auto 4, which is a very popular game produced by a studio called Rockstar. And you play as a character named Niko Bellic. He's an Eastern European immigrant, and he's out for revenge to get the man who betrayed him. And that woman, I don't think she's actually in the game. And that guy I can't remember who that guy is. Anyway, so this spot ran in downtown in downtown Los Angeles. This is basically one of the marquee advertising locations pretty much in the world, doing these 3 billboards on the side of Hotel Figueroa. So I thought, oh my goodness, video, and this game ended up generating around $400 million in its first 2 weeks after it came out. Which is crazy. And that record has since been surpassed, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But I felt there's all this cultural ammunition. We should be writing about video games. Put together this brief, sat down with my editor, and here's what he said. He's like, I don't get this video games thing. And they shuttled me off to write about television, and that was that. But I felt like there was a real need, for me, I felt like the type of writing that I saw in other sorts of places, I wasn't really getting with games. So I just wanted to talk a little bit. I'll give you a brief history of video games, really, really brief, and then we'll talk a little bit about where video games are right now. So video games basically started as a project that came out of the military. The DARPA, sort of the research arm of the military, created this game. There's two scientists there, created this game called Space War, which used an oscilloscope, which is normally used to kind of detect, use radar detection, and they used it to play basically sort of a tennis, Space War is that you play as a little ship, and you kind of like moved around and avoided different things. And then there's Pong after that, which many of you may remember, which was the next iteration. But basically video games started as, it was like a pet industry, right? It was something that was very, very small, and it started with very auspicious beginnings, but grew very, very quickly. So in the early 80s was the first big video game boom with things like Atari and ColecoVision, and every child had to have, I don't know, I had something called Intellivision. At this time period, there were a bunch of different console makers. So there were 7 or 8 different consoles that were coming out. And by consoles, I just mean the little video game box. So there were a bunch of different people all competing to be number one. And what happened was, in 1983, Steven Spielberg came up with this great idea. He was putting out this movie called E.T., and he thought it would be wonderful if there was a video game that went along with it. So E.T. was released, the movie was released in December, and Steven Spielberg came up with this idea somewhere around October, and they hired one guy to build a E.T. video game, and it was terrible. It was like one of the worst games ever made. It bankrupted Atari. It put more than 75% of the people working in video games out of business, because people basically believe if consumers couldn't go to stores and trust that they were able to buy a game that was quality, they felt like, well, this young, very young, it was a disastrous blow to this very, very young industry. And out of those ashes came along Nintendo, a Japanese company that originally started, it was over 100 years old, and originally started with playing cards. And in the early 70s, or then in the 80s, they started developing what was called the Famicom, the family computer. And so Nintendo basically ruled, that was the game systems that I grew up on. And since then, there have been several, basically you call them generations of video games. And this is something actually that's very interesting about video games, which separate it from other mediums, that you can really see Moore's Law very clearly in video games. So we're now in the 8th generation of consoles. But film doesn't have this really. So basically film had incremental jumps, maybe with higher resolution. So the jump from like VHS to DVD, right? Or VHS to Laserdisc, and then to DVD, right? And then music has had, well, there's physical records, and there were 8 tracks, and then there were regular cassettes, and then there were CDs, and then MP3s. And just in the last 30 years, there have been 8 different iterations of video game consoles, which is very, very strange, because it means that basically the industry gets kind of a reboot. So video games then moved into arcades, and they were very popular in the 80s. And I'll come back to this in a second. They started in arcades, and then they moved kind of indoors. And that's the place where I grew up. I basically started playing video games indoors. The graphical fidelity of video games has increased incredibly to near perfect. It's sometimes very difficult to tell the difference between what's happening in a video game world. And one of the most recent developments, just in the last year, has been a rebirth of motion video games, so video games that capture your movement, which I think is really great because it encourages social behavior between different people. But so basically we've kind of come full circle. So video games started as something, or in terms of arcades, were something that you played in front of other people, and now are kind of returning to those roots, becoming more simple and picking up different movements. There's a little video game camera called the Kinect, and it's associated with Microsoft's Xbox 360, and it's probably one of the most amazing pieces of hardware I've ever used. It's a little camera. It picks up 32 different articulation joints on your body, and it has facial detection, so it can tell the difference between 4 different people, which means that you can have 4 different people standing in front of it, flailing their arms, and it'll know which one of them is the most ridiculous. In any case, it's a very exciting time for video games, just in terms of the barriers for people to play them. That's what's very exciting about that, is the barriers to play them are very, very low. So I just want to, so this is where video games are right now. It's a $40 billion industry. It could be bigger. The reason why is because the $40 billion refers just to, it's just domestic, and also it's just games that are sold like at Best Buy or at Kmart or any of those places. But there's a much larger market, which is like iPhone games or money that's generated through Facebook games. So no one really has a good sense of how much money is actually spent on video games. And then there's like downloadable content, and there's other forms of revenue that come into the video games. The average age of a video game player is about 33, which is surprising to some people because there's a perception that video games are often kid stuff, which is true. But if you have 20 years of something being kid stuff, eventually kids become adults. Like I mentioned Grand Theft Auto 4, which is a game that came out 3 or 4 years ago. This year, just a couple months ago, there's a game called Call of Duty Black Ops, and that generated $1 billion in 6 weeks, which, if you think about it, it's basically like producing Avatar, right? But Avatar produced about that much money for about 10 times the budget, which is the other crazy thing, is that the cost of developing video games compared to the film, for example. If you have $60 million to produce a video game, a big budget action film is going to cost you like $200 million, but the return is a lot higher. Oh, I didn't finish that slide. So Cityville, oh goodness, there's a typo. In any case, Cityville is a game on Facebook. Today, there will be about 19 million people, 19 million different people who play this game, Cityville. And it's basically you have a little town, and you sort of serve as its God, and you serve over it. Just another statistic. There's a game called Angry Birds, which some of you may have played if you have an iPhone or an Android phone. Angry Birds sold around 100 million units this past year, all at 99 cents. 99 cents, I think it's $2.99 now. But the amount of time that people spend playing Angry Birds is about 200 million minutes a day, right? If you include all the people who play Angry Birds, which would be 1.2 billion minutes per year, which would be the equivalent of if you took everything that was written about Wikipedia and you basically did that every single month. That's how much time is being spent playing a game like Angry Birds, which you can imagine is a tremendous drain on global productivity. If only we could get that back. In any case, so what I find very interesting about video games, so I just want to talk a little bit about what I think makes video games different from other forms of media. What video games allow you to do is what a friend of mine, an author, his name's Tom Bissell, he talks about that video games allow you to author experiences. And Tom wrote this great book for Pantheon last year, and this is one of the quotes from it. He says, "So what have games given me?" He says, "Experiences, not surrogate experiences, but actual experiences, many of which are as important to me as they are any real memories." And I think there's this perception sometimes that the things that we do inside of video games that constitute some sort of other part of our existences, that these are other play spaces, these are things that, what happens in those worlds has no connection to what we do in our everyday life. And I would like to posit to you the same thing that my dear friend Tom is positing, is that these experiences that we have playing video games, whether it's Angry Birds or Super Mario Brothers or Halo, that these are things that are actually real. And the emotions that these games bring up and the way we feel when we interact with these games, those are legitimate experiences. Tom has also used this analogy, is like, how do you explain what happens with video games that's different from other things? So up until video games, right, most forms of entertainment were passive forms of media, right? So books or television, those are all things where you had a creator who would sit down and make something, and then you consumed it. And there are obviously differing opinions how we receive that information, how we interpret War and Peace, or how we interpret Crime and Punishment, or whatever it might be, or Citizen Kane. That might differ wildly, but the thing itself never actually changes. So when you sit down and watch a television show, that never really changes, right? But what happens with video games is very different in the sense that everybody plays a video game in a different way. It would be like if you were on the sidelines watching a tennis game and you're really enjoying it, and then a friend kind of nudges you and says, "You know what we could be doing instead of playing tennis? Instead of watching tennis, we could go down the court and actually play tennis." And that's basically what video games allow people to do. There's one thing that I also think that separates video games, and again, this is like an interpretation thing. There's a perception of what video games are that I think can be a little bit confusing. So video games operate on two very different levels. So the first would be the fiction world. So I'll use board games as an example. And there are two board games I'd like to use, Risk and another one called Diplomacy. So Risk, I presume, have you played Risk? Have people played Risk before? I presume that they have. So the fiction world of Risk, that would be sort of a world at war, right? It would be 1940s war, right? There's another game that's called Diplomacy, which takes place in the very, very same time period, right? So the way that Diplomacy works is that, so Risk is obviously turn-based, you go turn by turn, and then you roll die and your armies do battle. The way Diplomacy works is that everybody puts their moves into a hat, and then all of the moves are released at the same time. It's a very contentious game because it sort of requires you to stab your friends in the back at some point. So the mechanic in this case, so fiction refers to what a game is, and the mechanic refers to what a game does. So in this case, Risk, what that game does is Risk is a game about risk, right? It's about dice rolling. You roll the die and you might get something very, very different. You don't have a lot of control. Diplomacy, on the other hand, this game Diplomacy involves a lot of talking back and forth, and since you put all your moves into a hat, it requires, as the name would suggest, diplomacy. The reason why I think this is very, very important is the way that most people think about video games is the same way they think about television or the same way they think about film. So they look at what a video game is and they say, I'll give you a really good example. There's a game called Left 4 Dead, which is a zombie game, and you play as the last survivors of this zombie outbreak. It's a 4-person cooperative game. I really like cooperative games because I like playing with other people. But if you looked at that game, you would say, oh, well, that just looks like George Romero's Day of the Dead. So that would be the fiction world, right? But what actually happens in this game, it's a game entirely about cooperation and teamwork, right? It's entirely about helping your friends and being together as a group and sort of fighting, right? Fighting with each other. And as a result, the experience that you have playing a game like that, even though it's like a violent game because you're shooting zombies, what actually happens when you play that game is very, very different. It's not fear that you're necessarily feeling, but you actually feel the sense of camaraderie because you're fighting with other people. One other distinction between video games and other forms of media. So this comes from a really good book by a professor at Georgia Tech. It's called Game Spaces. And so video games operate on a variety of different levels. He calls them different spaces of play. So if you think about a book, for example, a book operates on a couple different levels. There's the physical, tactile experience of holding a book, right? And then there might be the experience of reading the words. And then maybe there's also a fictional, there's what the book is actually about. And then maybe there's also a fictional element of how you sort of get inside this world. And video games, the way video games work is that it's an amalgamation of all of these different things. So there's the world of the code, which is the technical programs that are required to run a game. There's this mediated space that he calls it. That's basically just what you see. There's this fictional space, which is how you interpret what you're seeing into your own world. There's the play space, which is actually actually what's happening when you hold the controller. And then this is the most important one. This is a social space. And then again, this is something that I think makes video games very, very different. It makes video games very, very different from other forms of media. So when you go to see a movie, for example, those are not social experiences. They're sort of social because you're with other people. Maybe people are laughing together. But the difference with video games is that you can actually, these can be procreative experiences in terms of you're building things together. So in this case, I guess it's a 2-person game because there's another little boy in the back with a hat and a very menacing alien, also a boy with a very round head. That doesn't always happen when you play video games, but sometimes. So I think what I love about games is that is this idea that like the more that we play is the more that we're actually becoming ourselves. And you see this in nature, for example. So animals play because they're training for a future of, in this case, if you're a lion and you're playing. This isn't just play, right? This is something that they're training to do so they can learn how to hunt and to kill for themselves. And I think the same thing happens when we play together, particularly in terms of social play. These are things that we're going to have to do. World of Warcraft is a good example of that. That's a team-based game, and you play in this fantasy world. It's online. And a lot of skills that people develop when they're playing World of Warcraft are the same ones that you might need in terms of being a leader in the real world. And that's why the military uses all these games, right? Because they see that there's all these team-building exercises, all these things that you do when you play games that can be very, very useful in battle. Businesses often do the same thing. There's another example that I've heard, which is of mahjong. A friend of mine told me this. He had married a girl from Hong Kong, and his father wanted to play him in mahjong because his father loved mahjong. And the reason why he did it is because he felt like my friend Simeon, that his personality would come out when he played mahjong, that he would get a better sense of this man who was going to marry his daughter by seeing how he played. Was he a risk taker? Was he conservative? Was he someone who followed the rules, or was somebody whose gameplay style might be a little bit dubious? There's another example that I like to use. There's a book by I'm drawing a blank. It's called Netherland. It was a book that came out about 2 years ago, and it's about a Dutchman who moves to New York. And there's this great passage in the book. It's basically about cricket and about all these all these places in New York where cricket is played. It's sort of the off the beaten track, so to speak, of New York City. So it's up high in the Bronx. And there's this scene where the main character, he's played cricket sort of the correct way. He's sort of played it as a child. And now he has to play in sort of courts like this, which are uneven, the pitch is uneven, and it's not the type of place that he was really accustomed to. And there's this moment in the book where he decides that he's going to play cricket the American way. And he basically steps up and he just sort of whacks the ball as hard as he can, which is not actually how you play cricket, right? It's not just about distance, but that's how you play an American way. And the author uses this as sort of a metaphor for things that are happening in his own life, that this sort of decision to become an American is actually sort of this metaphorical experience that he's making to become more ingrained in the place they live, in this case, New York. So I think that one of the powerful things about games is that we do have these really amazing experiences. The biggest thing, the thing that I'm most interested in, is that games basically allow people to tell stories about themselves by embodying other environments, by embodying other characters. I use this example. My grandfather was addicted to Tetris when he came to visit me, and the way that he would talk about Tetris, right, wasn't that, oh, I'm moving. He wouldn't say those blocks are moving. He would say, I'm moving the blocks. That's something that I'm doing, right? And we would often use Tetris as a way to kind of talk about what was happening in our day, talk about what was happening in his day. This is a screenshot from a game called Uncharted 2. It's a very similar situation happened with me. Obviously, the graphics of Tetris have come a long way since then. But there was an experience I had playing this game where I was playing as Drake, a bounty hunter, and there was this building that was falling down, and there was paper flying everywhere, and I was fighting this guy, and I slid between his legs and like kicked him out of this open window, and I had to press pause because it seemed like such an amazing experience. When you watch Jason Bourne or something like that, you're sort of loving the fact that he's doing those things, and what happens when you play games is that you get to take over those experiences, and they make you feel like they're your own particular thing. The other thing is that video games can really help us understand other types of experiences that we may not have necessarily had. This comes from a screenshot of a game that came out last year called Heavy Rain, and you play as 4 different characters, but the chief character is this guy who's a father, and his son is kidnapped, and he has to go through all these different trials to try and get his son back from the kidnapper. And I'm not, I don't have any kids, but there were moments in that game where I could understand what a father's affection was. There was a sense of loss because you lose him at the very beginning of the game. So video games can help us inhabit these other worlds and tell better stories. So I think I have a slightly better understanding, not a real understanding. And again, that's what my friend Tom is saying, is that these experiences are not real in the sense that they happen to us in the real world, but they're real in the sense that we do feel things that do have antecedents, that do actually exist in the real world. I think I'm probably running out of time. So just briefly in terms of the things that I'm interested in. So I run a video game arts and culture company called Kill Screen. The name comes from an early video game. Something used to happen in early video games when the machines, when you got to the end of the game, it would run out of memory and then just kind of throw up whatever was on there. So when you get 1,000,000 points in Asteroids, the game would effectively stop, and that was known as the kill screen. The rationale behind starting a magazine like that, we felt like that type of conversation I'm having with you is one that doesn't always happen around video games. And one of the things that basically holds video games back is the lack of dialogue. That video game culture doesn't really develop because people don't talk about what happens to them when they have play experiences. And so we wanted to try and create this place where we could tell good stories about people who make games, treat them as actual creatives, and people who play games. And I feel like the importance of me being up here and talking to you is that I think that there's a tendency sometimes to view video games, no matter how big or how small, to sort of view those as things that just sort of happen in this other arena of life. And I really think that play spaces that really, what video games do, I think that the ability to talk about what's happening in those games is really, really, really important. And I think that it's what's exciting to me is that because it's so new and because experiences like this are so new, that there's really an opportunity, I think, for we as Christians to think about how we can begin to talk about these sorts of things. I think this is really true in terms of thinking about like violence in video games, for example. Like we can talk more. That's a whole other subject. But that's something that I feel like if we don't have experiences seeing violent video games, particularly as adults, or talking about what those games actually do, or being able to make distinctions between what would be appropriate level of violence in a video game and what's a not appropriate level of violence in a video game. Because the question isn't whether or not video games are art, because I feel like that's already been, again, I can talk about that later as well. But the question is like, what type of art are they? Are they good art or they're bad art? In any case, I'm happy to field any other questions you have about video games. It's something I am incredibly, incredibly interested in. But thank you so much for your time.